So far, we've created all of our functions with explicit names. However, we can create functions without names called anonymous functions. So far, we've defined our functions using what we call the named function syntax, and it goes a little something like this. We insert the keyword function, give it a name like my function, give it the parameters that it will take, the arguments in parentheses here, and then give it a function body. And then later we can call my function like so. This named function is only one way that we can create a function in JavaScript. Functions are just like any other value in JavaScript. Much like arrays, numbers, and strings, they can be stored into variables, and that's kind of what's happening in this named function syntax. My function is really just a variable that holds a function with some code in it. However, there's a different way that we could go about doing this. Instead of beginning with the myFunction keyword, we can actually store it into a variable. So let's create a var called myFunction. And again, variable names are following the same rules as function names, so why not just store it into a variable? So we're creating a variable called myFunction, and we're assigning it what? Well, we can use the keyword function, but instead of putting a name here, we'll skip it altogether and move straight to the arguments by putting a space, parentheses, in our case we'll take no arguments, and then the body of a function. And let's just put some simple body here like console.log. My function was called. So now what we have is we have defined a function and stored it into my function, the variable. And if we call my function just like we do any normal function, we should get a very familiar result. So let's refresh, and we can see my function was called. And we can just treat my function like we have any other function. Just call it, it has return values, it takes arguments. It's almost indistinguishable from the previous syntax that we used. Now, since we don't give this function a name in the same way that we did before, we call this an anonymous function. We use the function keyword, define the arguments, and define the body of the function, all without giving it a specific name. Now, you can think of that as a named function because we immediately stored it into a variable that has a name, but that doesn't always have to be what we do with our anonymous functions. Let's say I want to create another function that's going to call a function twice. So since I'm creating a function, I can either use the anonymous function that we assign into a variable or use a named function. Now, in most cases, the difference is almost indistinguishable. However, there are some subtle differences, and so it's a matter of style choice. I usually prefer to store my functions as anonymous functions inside variables. However, I'll show you in a moment why a named function might be preferable. Let's just say var call twice equals, and we'll take a function. And the argument I want to pass to it is actually going to be another function. Like I said before, functions are just like any other value in JavaScript. They can be stored into variables and passed around. So we'll say target function is the name of our parameter. And in the body of our function, since I have target function, this should be holding a function value, which means that we can call the function by simply adding parentheses to the end. And we'll say that it will call target function with no properties twice. So now what do I want to do? Well, I'm going to remove this my function here. And instead, I'm going to call the function that I have stored in call twice. I do that by simply opening parentheses. And now I need to pass it the argument that will be stored into target function. Well, my call twice can only take functions as arguments, and I already have a function stored into a variable called myFunction. So let's see what happens. Now you'll notice when I typed in my function here, I left off the parentheses. I did not say my function, parenthesis open, parenthesis close. That would be completely different from what I want to do. If I left this code in place, what I would be doing is before I pass it to call twice, I'd be calling my function. And remember, calling my function will evaluate to the return value, which in my case, since there is no return value, would be undefined. So target function in call twice would be the value undefined. But if I don't put these parentheses, instead of calling my function, I'm actually passing the value that's stored in my function, the variable. And that's an actual function object. That function object is then assigned to target function inside call twice, and target function is called twice. So let's see the behavior of that. As you might guess, my function was called twice. Now that's pretty useful. Just to show you that the same thing would have worked if we had used the named function syntax, I'm going to change this to my function. So if we go back and refresh, we can see my function was called. Now, why might this be useful? Now, here's the reason that a named function might be more useful to you, especially in development, as compared to assigning an anonymous function into a variable. Let's say I did something like undeclared variable. Now, when I actually call this, it will actually try to find the variable called undeclared variable, which there is none. And in JavaScript, that will result in a reference error, which we've seen before. So let's see what happens. We get an uncaught reference error, undeclared variable is not defined. Now this is where the debugging comes in handy. In the console, it will give us a little bit of information about where this error came from. For instance, we can see the type of error it is, a reference error, as well as some description right here. We also get the line number where it comes from, which is well linked right in here, so we can jump right to the code. But sometimes that's not enough information for us. If we called my function multiple times, we'd want to find out exactly which call of my function raised that error. This little disclosure triangle here will open up what's called the call stack. Every function that we call is called by another function or an outer function. And so starting at the top is closest to where it actually got called. So since the error happened inside of my function, we see this name here. And we see that my function was called inside of call twice. Right now in Chrome, it looks like it's actually being quite smart about this. In some browsers, however, if we had defined our function in the anonymous sense, that is, say, my function, don't forget the var, which is very important, and remove this actually named part of our function. Now we can see that the call stack has given us my function and call twice as names that help us out. However, the top level is anonymous function. Now in some browsers, if we had gone with var my function and assigned it an anonymous function, it will not have that name associated with it. And our tools wouldn't be able to tell us very easily where or what function it is. However, later versions of more modern browsers are now really smart about this. It can detect when you're assigning an anonymous function into a variable, and it'll keep track of that name for you whenever it can. There are still cases where it can't quite do that, and we'll see that in a moment. So let's go back to call twice here. Now we've seen we're able to pass in an argument that's stored in a variable, which can be either stored in the variable using var my function equals the anonymous function, or by using a named function. However, we can use an anonymous function directly without worrying about assigning it to a variable. In some cases, we may only want to use this function this one time, and storing it into a variable is unnecessary just to call this. Well, since an anonymous function is really just an expression that returns a function, we can just use that anonymous function. So instead of giving it a name, we'll just pass into call twice the expression that we use to build a function, that is the function keyword, the parameters, and the body. Now, usually we want to split the body onto multiple lines, and that's totally okay to do. So we've opened up our curly brace. Inside of here, we're talking about our function that we're defining inside of this call twice call. And then we close our function with these curly braces, and this last parentheses here is the closing parentheses of the call twice call. So what happens is when we call this code, it'll evaluate this function definition, and then it'll pass that function into call twice. So we can do console.log hello from the anonymous function. And so if we refresh now, we see we get twice hello from anonymous function. So let's see what happens if we do undeclared variable here. We get undeclared variable is not defined, and this is what we tried to demonstrate in the first time. And if we unravel this, now we can see the call stack is slightly less helpful. We have anonymous function, which was called from call twice. And the reason it can't give us a name is because there really is no name for this function. This is quite literally an anonymous function, and JavaScript can't figure out a name for it because we didn't assign it into a variable or give it a name. Now, if we wanted to change that, we can do something like this. We can do function named function and give it a name just like we had normally done in our named function syntax. And let's see how this differs here. Now we can see that it does have a name, and anonymous function has been replaced with named function. However, this does create the variable called named function, which is accessible from the global scope. So really what this is doing is it's exactly the same as declaring a variable and passing it in. However, it just does it all in line. Now, if you're never going to use named function again, it may not be helpful to give it a name since you're never going to use it again. But again, you saw how it could be useful in debugging by giving it this name. Now, in this particular case, it's pretty easy to figure out what's going on in that type of error debugging because really we just called the function immediately from inside call twice. But if call twice had passed that function to another function and called much later, it may be very far disconnected from where we actually defined our anonymous function to where it's actually called, because it could be stored into a variable and called much later. By putting that name on it, if we are still unsure of where that anonymous function came from, the name can offer us a tool for tracking it down. Now, one last thing about anonymous functions. There's a cool little trick that you'll see very often in anonymous functions, and that's called a self-executing anonymous function. You remember that functions create their own scope, and in JavaScript, that's the only way to create a new scope. In other languages, different structures can create new levels of scope for either creating new variables that don't leak out to the global scope or reusing variables by shadowing. But in JavaScript, the only way you can create a new scope is through a function. But sometimes it doesn't make sense to really name a function and just call it. Well, what we can do is if we want to create a new scope, we can do exactly that. Let's create a function and call it immediately. So one way you could do this is we'll say temp function. And then from within here, we can create any variable we want, A, B, C, use them to our heart's content, and not worry about them, A, B, and C, being visible from the global scope. This is especially needed in JavaScript because all of the scripts on our page run in the same global scope. So if two scripts use the same variable, at the global scope, they could interact poorly. So it's good to scope all your variables. And then what we could do is just call temp function. And what we would essentially have is the code running on line 67 here, and whatever extra code here that actually uses A, B, and C, running immediately, but it would keep all the variables contained within that scope. And that's really useful, but it's a lot of code. And I made a mistake there. That should have been function, my temp function, or we could have stored an anonymous function into it. But let's see what we can do with this. How about instead of naming the function, we create it anonymously? Now, since we don't have a name, we can't execute it like that. But what if we could execute it right from here? Well, if we surround these in parentheses here are not acting as a function call, rather as a parentheses would act in a mathematical expression. Parentheses around a value will just evaluate to that value. So now, right here, these parentheses evaluates to a function object. And since we have a function object, we can call it immediately by using parentheses again. Now these parentheses are function execution parentheses, meaning they can take arguments like arg1, arg2. But these parentheses here are for syntax reasons, these parentheses right here. So this is saying everything in here evaluates to a function. And now that we have this function, we can call it immediately. This will allow us to do anything we want. So we can say console.log from anon function. And let's just say we're going to pass in 1 and hello. So if we refresh, we see from anonymous function. And I just had a typo there. So you'll see this in a lot of JavaScript libraries. And the reason it's useful is because var A, B, and C We can create all the variables we want, do all the stuff that we want, and we don't have to worry about any variables that we declare properly being leaked to the global scope and being accessible by other code. So this is just a little pattern that you'll see very often when you want to create a private scope where you can put all your variables and not have to worry about them interacting either by other scripts or other libraries using those same variable names. So now we've learned how to declare and use functions in JavaScript. Up next, we'll take a look at some practical examples of how functions are used in common JavaScript operations.